Welcome to Scoli Sleep Stories. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable, let the day soften around you, and settle in for a calm documentary made for curious minds. If these stories help you rest, learn, or simply enjoy a quieter part of the day, please consider liking this episode and subscribing to the channel. Now, when you are ready, let us begin. Chapter 1: A Crystal from Earth and Sea. If you hold a few grains of salt in your hand, they may seem almost too small to carry a history. They are pale, quiet things, easily scattered, easily dissolved. Some grains are fine as powder, others are coarse and bright, catching the light like tiny pieces of frost. Look closely, and a single crystal may show a simple shape, a little cube with straight edges and flat sides, as though it has been patiently built according to a pattern too small for the eye to follow. In everyday history, when people speak of salt, they usually mean a mineral called sodium chloride. Its chemical name is written as NaCl. Sodium and chlorine are two elements, and when they join together in this form, they make the familiar substance we know as table salt. A crystal is a solid whose parts are arranged in a regular repeating pattern. This is why pure sodium chloride often forms cube-shaped crystals, neat and orderly, even when they are no larger than grains of sand. Yet salt is not only a thing found in bowls and jars. It is part of the earth itself. It is carried in the ocean, hidden in stone, dissolved in springs, and spread across dry flats where old water has vanished into air. Long before people measured it, named it, or traded it, salt moved through the world in quiet ways. The oceans are the largest visible storehouse of salt. Every wave contains dissolved minerals, gathered slowly from rivers, rocks, rain, and the deep movements of the planet. Seawater holds many kinds of salts, but sodium chloride is the most abundant. On average, the open ocean is about 3.5% salt by weight. The exact amount varies from place to place. Some seas are saltier, where sunlight is strong and evaporation is high. Some waters are less salty, where great rivers pour fresh water toward the coast. Evaporation is one of the simplest and oldest makers of salt. It is the slow turning of liquid water into vapor. Under sunlight and dry air, water rises invisibly, leaving behind what it once held. In a shallow pool by the sea, the water may warm through the day, ripple in the wind, and gradually shrink. At first nothing much seems to happen. Then the edges become cloudy, a faint crust forms, the pool grows smaller and brighter until crystals begin to appear, scattered like pale seeds on wet earth. This same gentle process, repeated on a far greater scale, shaped many of the world's salt deposits. In ancient times, seas and lakes spread across places that are now plains, deserts, or mountains. Some were cut off from the open ocean, some lay in basins where rivers flowed in, but no water flowed out. Over long ages, heat and dryness drew the water away. Layer after layer of minerals settled on the floor. Later sand, clay, and stone covered them. The salt was buried, pressed, and preserved beneath the earth. Underground rock salt is called halite. The word may sound formal, but it simply means natural rock made mostly of sodium chloride. In a salt mine, walls of halite can be gray-white, pinkish, amber, or softly translucent, depending on the other minerals mixed with it. Ancient salt was not always pure white. It could be tinted by clay, iron, or traces of other substances left by the same vanished waters. Even now, pieces of rock salt can look like cloudy glass or stone touched with sunset. There are other, quiet places where salt comes to the surface. In some regions, water moves underground through salty rock, dissolving part of it along the way. When this water emerges as a spring, it is brine, or very salty water. A brine spring may look at first like any other small flow of water, but its taste tells a different story. In other places, people later dug or drilled wells to reach such salty water below the ground. These became brine wells, a way of drawing an ancient sea upward through darkness. Salt lakes also gather minerals over time. Where water enters a basin and leaves mainly by evaporation, the dissolved salts remain behind and grow more concentrated. Around the edges, pale rims can form. In dry seasons, the lake may retreat, exposing wide flats that shine in morning light. Some salt flats are smooth and bright, reflecting the sky like shallow mirrors. Others are rough underfoot, broken into ridges and plates by sun and wind. They are landscapes made of absence as much as presence, the memory of water written in crystal, Deserts, too, may hold salt in dried lake beds and mineral pans. The surface may seem still, but it records a long conversation between climate, stone, and time. Rain falls, minerals dissolve, water gathers, and then the dry air takes the water away. What remains is a crust, a powder, a layer, sometimes thin and fragile, sometimes thick enough to be cut and carried. Before salt entered kitchens, storehouses, taxes, and trade routes, it belonged to these natural cycles. It was lifted by waves, settled by lakes, drawn through stone, and left behind by sunlight. It could be tasted on sea air, seen as a pale line along a shore, or found in the earth where an old ocean had once rested. It was both common and hidden, both ordinary and precious, depending on where one stood. A grain of salt, then, is not only a seasoning. It is a small crystal with a long beginning. It may have come from a modern evaporation pond, from a deep mine, from a briny spring, or from a lake under a wide, dry sky. Its shape is simple, but its journey is spacious. Water carried it, sunlight revealed it, earth sheltered it. And long before people learned to boil brine, cut salt from rock, or carry it along roads, living creatures found it where the landscape offered it. Animals followed mineral scents to damp springs and exposed earth. Hooves made paths toward salty places. Early humans, watching the shore, the spring, and the tracks of animals, would one day notice the same pale substance waiting quietly in the world. Chapter 2. First Gatherers of Salt. Long before salt was carried in sacks, traded in markets, or poured from a small bowl at a table, it waited quietly in the landscape. It lay in pale crusts beside drying lakes. It gathered in shallow pools near the sea, where sunlight warmed the water and left a thin brightness behind. It seeped from the earth in mineral springs, where the ground felt damp and the water tasted sharp on the tongue. In some places, it appeared in exposed soil or stone, not always pure white, but gray, brown, or faintly colored by other minerals. The first people to notice salt did not leave us written records. Their discoveries happened too early for names, too softly for certainty. Yet it is easy to imagine that they learned by watching the world around them. Animals often know where minerals can be found. Deer, wild cattle, goats, and other creatures may travel again and again to places called salt licks. A salt lick is a natural spot where salty minerals are exposed in earth, rock, or water. There, animals lower their heads and lick the ground, returning along familiar paths worn by many hooves. Early humans, observant and patient, may have followed such trails. A line of tracks through grass or woodland could lead to a damp hollow where the soil tasted mineral-rich. A hillside spring might leave a pale mark on stones as its water dried. A lake edge after many days of sun might show rough crystals underfoot. In such places, people could taste, notice, remember, and return. Salt mattered because living bodies need sodium, one of the two elements in common salt. The other is chlorine, and together they form sodium chloride, the mineral most people mean when they say salt. Sodium is needed in small amounts. It helps the body keep fluids in balance, so that water is held and moved properly. It helps nerves carry messages. It helps muscles work. These processes are quiet and hidden, but they are part of every step, every breath, every movement of the hand. Still, the need for extra salt was not the same for every group of early people. Human diets varied greatly. Some hunter-gatherers ate meat, blood, fish, shellfish, or other foods that could provide enough sodium. Coastal people living near the sea may have found salty foods and natural salt more easily. Inland groups, especially those far from mineral springs or salt-bearing soils, may have valued salt more when they encountered it. Climate also mattered. In warm places where people lost more salt through sweat, the desire for salty foods may have been stronger. In cooler regions or among groups eating sodium-rich foods, the need may have been less noticeable. There was no single human story of salt, but many small stories, shaped by land, weather, animals, and food. The evidence from these very early times is difficult to read. Salt dissolves, rain carries it away. A lump of salt may vanish into water, leaving no clear trace for archaeologists to find thousands of years later. Archaeological evidence means the physical clues left behind by people of the past. Tools, pottery, hearths, bones, buildings, ash, or marks in the ground. Salt itself often leaves only faint signs, unless people used containers, built fires, or worked repeatedly in one place. Because of this, we cannot point to one first discovery of salt. There was likely no single moment when humanity found it. Instead, there were many discoveries, in many landscapes over many generations. A child might taste a crystal from the edge of a pool. A hunter might notice animals gathering near a spring. A family might return to a dry basin where white crust formed after summer heat. Knowledge could pass quietly from hand to hand, from elder to younger, from one camp to another. In time, some people began doing more than gathering salt where it appeared. They learned to draw it out of salty water or brine. Brine is simply water with a great deal of salt dissolved in it. If brine is warmed or left in the sun, the water slowly disappears into the air. This process is called evaporation. When enough water is gone, the salt remains. At first, such work may have been very simple. A shallow hollow near the shore, a skin, basket, or pot holding salty water, a small fire warming brine until steam lifted into the air. Along the rim of a vessel, tiny grains could begin to form, pale and rough to the touch. The result might be a small amount, but even a small amount could matter. Some of the earliest known places connected with salt production come from Neolithic communities. Neolithic means the later part of the Stone Age, when many groups in different parts of the world began farming, keeping animals, making pottery, and living for longer periods in settled places. These changes did not happen everywhere at once, and they did not replace older ways immediately. But in many regions, they changed the relationship between people and salt. One important early site is Poiana Slotny in what is now Romania. There, archaeologists have found evidence that people were using salty spring water or brine around the 6th millennium BCE, more than 7,000 years ago. The traces suggest that communities returned to this source and used it over time, likely heating the brine to obtain salt. Another early salt production center often discussed by archaeologists is Provadia Solnitsata in what is now Bulgaria. It was active in the later 6th to 5th millennium BCE. The name itself is connected with salt, and the site has drawn attention because of its early production and the settlement that grew nearby. It reminds us that salt could become more than something gathered casually. It could help shape where people lived, how they worked, and what they exchanged with others. Even so, these places should not be called the first salt sites for all humanity. They are among the early known examples, preserved well enough for modern study. Other people, in other lands, may have gathered or made salt without leaving traces that survived. The story of salt begins in fragments: a spring here, a broken pot there, a layer of ash, a worn path, a memory held in practice. Picture a quiet morning near a mineral spring. The ground is soft where animals have stepped. Reeds bend gently. The water, clear but strong tasting, rises from below the earth. Nearby, a small fire burns low, and a clay vessel warms slowly. Steam lifts and fades. No one is in a hurry. The work is patient, guided by attention, rather than by written instruction. Or imagine a coast after the tide has gone out. The sun rests on their surfaces, and the water grows saltier as the day passes. Along the edges, a faint crust begins to appear. Someone touches it, lifts a grain to the tongue, and knows the taste. It is sharp, familiar, useful. It belongs to the sea, but it can be carried inland. These first gatherers of salt lived close to signs that modern life often hides: the path of animals, the taste of water, the season when pools dry, the places where earth gives up something needed. Their knowledge was practical and careful. They did not need chemistry to understand that some waters and stones held a special taste. They did not need maps to remember where animals gathered or where sunlight left crystals behind. As people moved through forests, coasts, plains, and river valleys, salt moved with them in small ways, a little wrapped in leaves, a little stored in a vessel, a little shared with others. Over many generations, these small acts prepared the way for larger changes. The wandering paths would gradually lead toward more settled places. People would plant fields, tend animals, store grain, dry fish, make cheese, and think more carefully about the seasons ahead. In those quieter, more permanent communities, salt would become not only something found in nature, but something gathered with intention, made with skill, and saved for the days to come. Chapter 3: Salt and the First Settlements. As people began to live for longer seasons in one place, the meaning of salt slowly changed. In earlier times, a person might have found salt at the edge of a spring, in a coastal pool, or along a dry lake bed. It was something tasted, gathered, and carried in small amounts. But with farming and settled life, salt became part of planning. It joined the quiet work of storing grain, tending animals, shaping clay vessels, and preparing food for days that had not yet arrived. A settlement was more than a cluster of shelters. It was a place of return. Fields were planted nearby. Paths became familiar. Water jars stood near doorways. Children learned where the best shade fell in the afternoon. Families watched the seasons carefully, knowing that a full harvest might be followed by months of cold, dryness, or waiting. In such a world, food preservation mattered deeply. Preservation means keeping food usable for longer than it would last on its own. Before refrigeration, people relied on many gentle but skillful methods. They dried food in the sun or in moving air. They smoked meat or fish above slow fires. They fermented milk or vegetables, allowing helpful tiny living things, called microbes, to change the food in ways that could protect it and deepen its flavor. They stored roots and grains in cool places, and they used salt. Salt helped because it could draw moisture out of food. Many of the microbes that cause spoilage need water to grow easily. When enough salt was added, the food became a less welcoming place for them. Salt did not make every food last forever, and it was often used together with drying, smoking, or fermenting, but it became one of the most useful tools people had for carrying food across time. Along a river, fish could be cleaned, rubbed with salt, and laid out to dry in the open air. Near grazing lands, milk could be turned into cheese, and salt helped shape its taste and keeping quality. In farming villages, vegetables might be packed into salty brine, which is simply salty water, and left in jars or crocks. Meat from herds or hunts could be cured with salt and sometimes smoke, making it easier to store or carry on a journey. The work was practical, but it had a rhythm of its own. One may imagine a cool storage room, dim and still, with jars lined along the wall. Baskets of dried fish rest near bundles of herbs. Clay pots hold salted cheese or vegetables beneath smooth stones. Outside, the year moves onward. The fields change color. The air grows cooler or drier, yet inside the storage room, some part of the season has been carefully saved. This saving of food supported many kinds of human life. It helped communities through winter, when fresh plants were fewer. It helped during drought, when crops might not grow well. It helped travelers, herders, and traders carry nourishment across distances. It helped fill the uncertain spaces between harvests. Salt also mattered to animals. Livestock, like humans, need some salt for their bodies to function well. Herding communities learned to provide salt to cattle, sheep, goats, and other animals, especially where natural sources were scarce. A place with nearby pasture, water, and access to salt could become especially useful. Still, salt was only one part of choosing where to live. People also needed good soil, safe ground, wood or fuel, building materials, and paths to other communities. In many early settlements, salt had to be made as well as gathered. Some people collected brine from salty springs, where mineral-rich water rose naturally from the earth. They poured it into pottery vessels or shallow pans and warmed it over a steady fire. As the water slowly turned to vapor, the salt remained behind. Steam lifted into the air. The liquid grew stronger and denser. Along the rim of a pot, pale grains began to appear, like a faint crust of frost. In coastal places, people learned to use the sun and wind. Shallow basins could be filled with seawater and left to evaporate. Evaporation is the simple process by which water turns into vapor. As the water disappeared into the air, salt crystals formed in the basin. This method required patience and suitable weather. It depended on sunlight, dry air, and careful movement of water from one pool to another. Inland, where there was no sea, salty springs could be just as valuable. A village near such a spring might gather more salt than it needed for itself. The extra could be traded for grain, stone, pottery, cloth, tools, or animals. In this way, salt helped connect people who lived in different landscapes. Coastal communities could send salt inland. Inland communities near brine springs could send it along river paths or overland tracks. Spring-rich regions, farming valleys, and herding lands became linked by repeated journeys. Archaeologists who study the physical traces of past human life sometimes find signs of this early salt making. Salt itself dissolves easily and often disappears from the ground, but the work around it can leave clues. Pottery fragments may remain where vessels once cracked from heat. Hearths may show where fires burned. Ash layers can mark repeated boiling. Clay supports may reveal where pots or pans were held above flames. These traces are modest, but meaningful. They do not always tell a complete story, yet they suggest repeated, organized labor. People gathered fuel, they shaped vessels, they carried brine, they tended fires, they waited as water slowly left the pot and crystals gathered in its place. The salt made in this way was not always pure white. It might contain other minerals from the spring, the soil, the clay vessel, or the sea. It could be grayish, reddish, or uneven in texture. But its usefulness did not depend on perfect appearance. What mattered was that it could season food, support animals, and help preserve what a household or village had worked hard to produce. Over generations, these simple practices became part of settled life. Salt was present at the edge of the fire, in the storage room, near the herds, and along the road to the next village. It belonged to daily labor more than to grand display. It was measured in handfuls, packed into baskets, dissolved into brine, and scattered over food with care. And in the quiet steam rising from early vessels of salty water, another chapter of salt's history was beginning. In some places, people would learn not only to gather brine from the surface, but to draw it from deep within the earth. Far to the east, in the river valleys and inland basins of ancient China, the craft of bringing up salty water would become especially refined, with wells, pipes, and patient fires turning hidden brine into pale crystals. Chapter 4: Ancient China and the Brine Wells. Far to the east, in a land of broad rivers, high mountains, coastal flats, and inland basins, salt found many forms. Along the seacoast, seawater could be gathered and left to the patient work of sun and wind. Around salty lakes, crystals appeared along the shore when water withdrew. In some places, people found rock salt within the earth. And in deep inland regions, especially in Sichuan, salt came from hidden waters below the ground. These hidden waters were brines, very salty waters resting in underground layers of stone. To reach them, people dug and drilled wells. A brine well was not a well for ordinary drinking water, but a passage down to an old mineral source. It was, in a quiet way, like drawing up a buried memory of an ancient sea. China's salt history is very long, and it did not begin in only one place or with one single invention. Different regions learned from their own landscapes. Coastal communities made sea salt. Inland communities used salt lakes, rock deposits, and brine springs. Over many centuries, these methods became more organized and more skilled. In Sichuan, where folded hills and river valleys hold many underground resources, brine wells became especially important. One may imagine a misty morning in a Sichuan valley. The air is cool and damp. Hills rise softly beyond fields and riverbanks. At a work site, a narrow well descends into the earth. Nearby are wooden frames, lengths of bamboo, clay vessels, and boiling houses where steam drifts upward in slow white ribbons. The people working there know the ground not as an empty surface, but as something layered, holding water, minerals, and sometimes gas far below. The engineering developed gradually. Early wells may have been shallower, reaching brine closer to the surface. Later, people learned to go deeper. They used tools lowered into narrow shafts, working steadily through layers of earth and stone. It was careful, patient labor. The well had to remain open, the brine had to be lifted, the equipment had to be repaired and watched. Each part of the process depended on experience passed from one worker to another. In some regions, bamboo became one of the great helpers of salt making. Bamboo is strong, light, and hollow, with natural sections that can be shaped and joined. Lengths of bamboo could be used as pipes to carry brine from wells to boiling areas. Laid in orderly lines, these pipes turned the landscape into a gentle network of movement. The salty water did not need to be carried every step in jars or buckets. It could travel through tubes, guided by human planning. Once the brine reached the boiling house, the water had to be removed. This was done by heating the brine in vessels or pans, until the water slowly escaped as vapor. What remained was salt. At first the surface might shimmer with heat, then small crystals would begin to gather, carrying the faint mineral scent of brine. Workers tended the fires, watched the pans, and collected the salt when it was ready. Fuel was always an important question in salt making. Boiling brine requires heat, and heat requires wood, charcoal, or some other source of energy. In Sichuan, people eventually learned to use natural gas from underground as fuel. Natural gas is a flammable gas found beneath the earth. In some places it rose near the same deep layers that held brine. Over time, Chinese salt workers found ways to bring this gas to the surface and burn it under boiling pans. This was an important early use of natural gas, though it developed over many generations, rather than appearing all at once. The result was a salt industry that joined earth, water, bamboo, fire, and careful administration. Brine came from below. Bamboo carried it across the ground. Fire changed it into crystals. Officials counted, taxed, stored, and moved the finished salt. The work belonged not only to laborers and artisans, but also to governments, merchants, and households. Because everyone needed salt, rulers paid close attention to it. Salt was useful in kitchens, for preserving food, for feeding animals, and for daily life. It was also easier to monitor than many other goods, because production often happened at known places: wells, coastal pans, lakes, and mines. For this reason, Chinese governments often controlled or taxed salt. The money collected from salt could become revenue, meaning income for the state. Such revenue helped support armies, roads, officials, and public administration. Traditional accounts connect the state of Qi in eastern China with early policies involving salt and iron. Salt and iron were both practical materials widely needed and valuable to control. Whether in tools, cooking, farming, or trade, they touched ordinary life. Over time, the idea that the state might manage such important goods became part of political discussion. During the Han Dynasty, this became especially significant. In 119 BCE, the Han government established major state monopolies over salt and iron. A monopoly means that one authority controls the making or selling of something. In this case, the government took a central role in managing these important resources. The purpose was not simply to gather salt, but to regulate production, sale, and income. Salt, small as each grain might be, became part of the large structure of empire. Not everyone agreed about this. In 81 BCE, a famous debate known as the Discourses on Salt and Iron took place. Officials and scholars discussed whether state monopolies were wise and fair. Some argued that government control brought needed revenue and order. Others worried about burdens on the people and the effects of too much official interference in trade and daily life. The debate reminds us that salt was never only a substance. It was also a question of how society should be arranged. Still, beyond the debates and ledgers, there remained the steady work itself. Brine was lifted from dark wells, bamboo pipes carried it in quiet lines, fires warmed the pans, steam rose into the air and faded among the roofs. In a bowl, a sack, or a storehouse, the finished salt looked simple, pale, dry, crystalline, yet behind it lay a deep knowledge of land and water. From China's inland wells, the story of salt moves gently toward another ancient landscape, shaped by both water and dryness. There, along the Nile, river life met desert air, and salt mingled with natron, food, and ritual care beneath a clear Egyptian sun. Chapter 5: Egypt, Fish, and the Desert Sun. Along the Nile, life gathered in a long green ribbon. Beyond the river banks, the desert stretched outward in pale gold and warm stone. But near the water, reeds moved softly in the breeze, fields drank from the annual flood, boats passed with slow confidence, and fish flickered beneath the surface. Ancient Egypt grew from this meeting of river and desert, abundance and dryness, water and sun. Salt belonged naturally to this landscape. Some salt came from ordinary sources, salty earth, dried pools, and trade with places where crystals could be gathered. But Egypt was also known for another mineral substance called natron. Natron was related to salt in the broad sense of being a mineral from dry places, but it was not the same as table salt. Table salt is mostly sodium chloride. Natron was a natural mixture, often containing sodium carbonate, sodium bicarbonate, sodium chloride, and sodium sulfate. These names sound complex, but they simply describe different mineral salts, each with its own character. Together in natron, they formed a pale, powdery, or crusted material, useful for drying, cleaning, and ritual care. Much natron came from dry lake beds, especially from a place later known as Wadi Natrun, a desert valley northwest of the Nile. In such basins, mineral-rich waters rose, settled, and slowly evaporated under the heat of the sun. As the water disappeared, pale deposits remained. One can imagine the scene quietly, a dry hollow under a wide sky, the air clear and still, the ground marked by chalky crusts of mineral. Gatherers could collect natron from these beds, carrying it away in baskets, jars, or sacks, to be used in homes, workshops, temples, and burial places. The Nile itself offered food in generous variety. Fish were caught with nets, hooks, and traps. Some were eaten fresh, especially near the river. Others needed to last longer. In a warm climate, fresh fish spoiled quickly, so Egyptians used familiar methods of preservation, drying in the sun, salting, and sometimes combining both. Salt drew moisture out of food, and drying removed still more water. With less moisture, many tiny organisms that caused spoilage could not grow as easily. In this way, fish could be kept for later days, carried to workers, sold in markets, or sent along the river. Near the banks, fish might be cleaned and laid out in orderly rows, resting under the bright Egyptian sun. The air would carry river smells, smoke from cooking fires, and the dry mineral scent of salt. Reeds whispered nearby, boats moved past with jars of grain, bundles of flax, pottery, oil, and preserved foods. A salted fish, wrapped or packed with care, became more than a meal for one day. It became part of planning, storage, and travel. Preserved foods helped sustain many kinds of people. Households stored food for seasons when fresh supplies were less certain. Travelers carried durable provisions along desert roads or river routes. Workers on large building projects needed steady meals, and dried or salted foods helped make that possible. In Egyptian daily life, as in many ancient societies, preservation was not a small matter. It was a quiet form of order, a way of extending the river's gifts beyond the moment of catching or harvesting. Salt and natron were also useful beyond food. Natron had cleansing qualities. It could be used in washing, in preparing certain materials, and in ritual purification. The word purification means making something clean or fit for a sacred purpose. In Egyptian religion, cleanliness was often more than physical neatness. It could carry meaning, helping people prepare for prayer, temple service, or important ceremonies. The temples of Egypt were places of careful repetition. Priests followed rituals handed down through tradition, with gestures, words, offerings, and cleansings performed in precise ways. Natron, gathered from the desert, could be part of this sacred order. It linked the dry mineral world beyond the fields with the spiritual life of the river valley. Natron was also central to mummification, the Egyptian practice of preserving the dead. This should be understood gently and respectfully. For ancient Egyptians, mummification was not only a practical technique. It was deeply connected with beliefs about the afterlife, the continued journey of the person, and the care owed to the dead by the living. The dry climate of Egypt already helped preserve bodies naturally in some circumstances, and over time Egyptians developed more elaborate ritual methods. Natron helped by drawing out moisture, assisting in preservation. Linen wrappings, prayers, resins, and ceremonies all belonged to this careful process. In this use, natron was both material and meaningful. It was a mineral from the desert, but it served a spiritual purpose. The same landscape that gave Egypt sharp sunlight and dry wind also gave a substance that could help preserve, cleanse, and prepare. Desert dryness, river abundance, and human belief came together in a quiet harmony. Everyday salt and natron therefore lived in many parts of Egyptian life. They touched fish laid out in sunlight, jars stored in shade, hands washed before ritual, and linen prepared with care. They belonged to kitchens and temples, river docks and desert basins. They helped connect ordinary meals with long journeys, and practical preservation with sacred tradition. The contrast is part of what makes Egypt's salt history so vivid. The Nile brought water, mud, crops, boats, birds, and fish. The desert brought dryness, minerals, clear horizons, and still air. Between them, people learned to preserve what was plentiful, to clean what was sacred, and to carry food and meaning across time. As evening settled over the river, clay jars might rest cool in the shade of a storeroom. Boats could be tied along the bank, their hulls touching the slow current. Somewhere beyond the fields, in dry basins under fading light, pale natron lay quietly on the earth, and along the Nile stored food, sealed vessels, and steady water routes hinted at a wider world, where salt would travel farther still, by road, by river, and by sea. Chapter 6. Salt Roads of the Ancient World. As people learned where salt could be found, they also learned where it could not. Some communities lived near the sea, where shallow pools could dry in the sun and leave a pale crust behind. Others lived beside salty springs or near rock deposits hidden in hills and mountains. But many people lived far from such places, in river valleys, forests, grasslands, and inland villages where salt did not appear easily. So salt began to travel. It traveled slowly at first, in baskets, skins, jars, and cloth bundles. It moved on the backs of people, on pack animals, in small carts, and in boats that followed rivers at an unhurried pace. A little salt could go a long way, and because nearly everyone needed it, it became one of the steady goods of exchange. It did not move alone. Along the same paths came grain, metal, cloth, oil, wine, fish, animals, pottery, and stories from other places. A trade route is simply a path or network used to move goods between communities. Some trade routes were broad roads, made firm by stone or gravel. Others were no more than footpaths worn smooth by generations. Some followed riverbanks, where boats could carry heavy loads more easily than carts. Others crossed mountain passes, deserts, coasts, and plains. When salt moved along them often enough, people remembered those routes by its name. Yet a salt road was not always one single road made only for salt. It might be a formal road, a chain of market towns, a river passage, or a loose pattern of exchange. It might carry salt for part of its length and other goods for the rest. In this way, salt helped draw lines of connection across the ancient world, not as a sudden force, but as a repeated habit, a journey made again and again until the path itself became part of daily life. In the mountains of Central Europe, salt lay hidden in ancient deposits left by vanished seas. One of the most famous places was Hallstatt, in what is now Austria. Long before modern maps, people there worked rich salt deposits in the alpine landscape. The name Hallstatt has become associated with both salt mining and a wider Iron Age culture, because the salt trade helped support communities with skill, wealth, and far-reaching contacts. Imagine a mountain morning there, cool air resting among dark trees, a pale track curving along a ridge, pack animals stepping carefully over stone. Salt from the mountains might be carried outward, while other goods moved inward. Metalwork, amber, cloth, and food could pass from hand to hand. The salt itself, sometimes gray or tinted by other minerals, was not always the bright white grain we picture today, but it was useful, durable, and welcome. Later, other alpine salt regions became important too, including the area around Salzburg. The name Salzburg means salt fortress, or salt castle, a reminder of how deeply salt shaped the memory of the region. As in many salt-producing places, geography mattered. Mountains held the mineral. Rivers and roads helped carry it away. Towns grew where people could gather, store, tax, weigh, and trade. Farther south, around the Mediterranean, salt could be gathered in another way. Along low coasts and quiet lagoons, seawater was guided into shallow basins called salt pans. A salt pan is a wide, shallow place where seawater or brine is left to evaporate. Under warm sun and steady wind, the water slowly disappeared, leaving crystals behind. The work required patience and careful timing. Too much rain could dilute the brine, too little care could leave the salt mixed with mud or unwanted minerals. In these coastal places, salt was part of a larger rhythm of sea trade. Boats carried jars of oil, wine, fish sauce, grain, pottery, and cloth from harbor to harbor. Salt could preserve fish caught in abundance, making it easier to carry food farther inland. Coastal salt pans, marketplaces, and ports became linked together by ropes, sails, wooden hulls, and the regular return of merchants who knew the winds and seasons. Rivers also helped salt travel. A river boat could carry more than a single animal or cart, and it could move goods through landscapes that might otherwise be difficult to cross. Along a river in the cool morning, one might see jars packed beside sacks of grain, bundles of wool, and small quantities of salt wrapped against dampness. The boat would drift or be rowed forward, stopping at settlements where people came down to the landing place to trade. In Italy, the Roman Via Salaria became one of the most remembered salt roads. Its name means salt road, and tradition links it with the movement of salt between Rome and salt-producing areas, including those near the mouth of the Tiber and toward the Adriatic side of the peninsula. Its earliest history is complex, and like many old routes, it likely developed over time from older paths and practical needs. Still, the name preserves an important truth. Salt was one of the goods that gave roads meaning. A road is more than its surface. It is also the footsteps upon it, the animals led along it, the carts repaired beside it, the inns, shrines, wells, and markets that appear near it. A road can shape a town simply by bringing people through. When salt was weighed, stored, or sold in a certain place, that place might become more important. A market town could wake before sunrise, with shutters opening, animals stamping softly, and merchants arranging their goods in the cool air. Salt in small sacks might sit beside olives, wool, fish, tools, and loaves of bread. Beyond Europe, salt traveled through many landscapes in Africa and Asia. In dry regions where salt might be found in desert flats or mineral deposits, caravans carried it from source to market. A caravan is a group of people and animals traveling together, often over long distances. The pace was steady and practical. Pack animals moved from water source to water source, and goods were wrapped, balanced, and watched with care. In desert routes, oasis towns were especially important. An oasis is a place where water allows trees, gardens, animals, and people to live in a dry land. Such towns could become resting places and trading centers. Salt might arrive from a distant basin or mine, while grain, cloth, metal goods, or other supplies moved in return. These routes did not belong to salt alone. They were part of wider patterns of exchange, shaped by climate, season, language, trust, and long experience. In Asia, too, salt moved along rivers, coasts, and inland roads. In some regions it came from brine wells, in others from lakes or the sea. It might travel by boat through river valleys, by cart along packed earth roads, or by animals across uplands. Wherever salt sources were unevenly spread, exchange helped balance the difference. One village had salt, another had grain. Trade made distant landscapes useful to one another. Over time, these journeys gave salt a quiet political importance. Whoever controlled a salt source, a bridge, a river port, or a mountain pass could influence the movement of goods. Sometimes authorities taxed salt or guarded its routes. Sometimes towns grew prosperous because travelers stopped there. Yet even when rulers and merchants appear in the story, the movement of salt remains human-scaled. It is measured in footsteps, jars, baskets, boatloads, and the careful tying of bundles before a journey. It is pleasant to think of salt as a traveler with no voice of its own, yet with a way of bringing voices together. A lump of mountain salt might pass into a valley market. Sea salt might move inland in a clay jar. Desert salt might rest beneath a woven covering on the back of an animal. Along the way, people exchanged greetings, counted weights, shared news, and learned the habits of neighboring lands. In this way, salt helped make the ancient world feel a little less separate. It connected coast to inland village, mountain to plain, river to market, and desert edge to oasis town. It moved with ordinary goods and ordinary people, following roads that were sometimes named and sometimes forgotten. And as the day faded over those old paths, one might imagine the last light resting on a worn track where countless travelers had passed, carrying pale crystals from one place of need to another. Chapter 7. Rome and the Value of Salt. In the Roman world, salt belonged to both the ordinary and the important. It stood beside bread, oil, wine, herbs, fish, and grain as one of the quiet materials of daily life. A pinch could sharpen the taste of food. A layer could help preserve fish or meat for a longer journey. Mixed into certain preparations, it could be used in medicine. Placed in offerings or ritual acts, it carried meaning beyond the kitchen. Given to animals, it helped care for working creatures that pulled carts, carried loads, and grazed beyond the city walls. Rome grew near landscapes where salt could be made and moved. To the west of the city, the Tiber River flowed down toward the sea, winding through low ground before meeting the coast. Near the river mouth were salt works that mattered to early Rome. There, shallow pools could hold seawater, while sun and wind slowly drew the water away. What remained was a pale mineral crust, gathered by human hands and carried inland. One may imagine the coast in the softer hours of the day, when the light lay flat across the pans and the water shone like small mirrors. The air would have carried the scent of mud, reeds, and sea. Workers tended the basins, watched the weather, and waited for the crystals to form. Salt making was not only a matter of finding salt, but of patience. Guiding water, letting it settle, letting it dry, and then collecting what the sun had left behind. From such coastal places, salt traveled toward towns and farms. It moved in baskets, sacks, carts, and boats. It followed paths that had been worn by many feet. Among the old roads linked with salt was the Via Salaria, often translated as the Salt Road. Its early history is complex, as many ancient roads grew from older paths and served many purposes. Still, tradition connects the Via Salaria with the movement of salt inland from coastal sources, especially toward communities that needed it for food, animals, and trade. A Roman road could seem simple at first glance, a pale line of stone, dust, and packed earth crossing the countryside. Yet roads carried the rhythm of an empire. Along them moved farmers, merchants, officials, soldiers, animals, letters, tools, cloth, pottery, and food. Salt was one cargo among many, but it was a steady one. Because everyone needed it in some measure, it had a way of linking distant places through repeated, practical exchange. In the city itself, salt appeared in many forms. At a market stall, one might find olives, bread, onions, herbs, cheese, and small containers of salty sauce. Amphorae, the two-handled clay jars used across the Roman world, stood stacked in storerooms and shops. Some held wine or oil, others held fish sauce, one of the distinctive flavors of Roman cooking. The best known of these sauces was garum, a salty fermented fish sauce. Fermentation is a natural process in which tiny living organisms change food over time. In garum and related sauces, fish and salt were combined and allowed to transform into a strong, savory liquid. To Roman cooks, such sauces could add depth to many dishes, much as salt itself brings out flavor. They were produced in various places around the Mediterranean, often near coasts where fish and salt were both available. Salted fish was also widely used. In a world without modern refrigeration, preserving food required skill and planning. Salt helped draw moisture from food and made it harder for many spoilage microbes to grow. It was often used together with drying, smoking, or fermentation. These methods did not make every food last forever, but they extended its usefulness. They allowed fish from one coast to reach an inland table, or food prepared in one season to be eaten in another. Salt also had a place in Roman medicine and animal care. Ancient medical ideas differed from modern science, but Roman writers and practitioners recognized salt as a useful substance in certain treatments, washes, and preparations. For animals, salt helped support health, especially for livestock and working beasts. A farmer or herder understood that animals, like people, needed mineral balance, even if the explanation was not written in modern terms. In religion and ritual, salt could carry ideas of purity, offering, and continuity. The Romans used salted meal in certain sacred preparations, including a mixture known as molla salsa, made with grain and salt, and associated with ritual offerings. Here salt was not only useful, it was meaningful. Its brightness, preservative power, and ancient association with nourishment made it suitable for acts that connected households, temples, and tradition. Because salt was so woven into daily life, it also entered language. One of the most repeated stories about Rome says that soldiers were paid in salt. This simple version is familiar, but it is too certain. The English word salary does indeed come from the Latin word salarium, and salarium is connected to sal, the Latin word for salt. Yet scholars debate exactly what salarium first meant. It may have referred to money given for buying salt, It may have been an allowance connected with provisions, or it may have developed into a broader word for payment. So, it is better to speak gently and carefully. The words are related, and salt was important enough to leave a trace in language, but Roman soldiers were not simply paid with handfuls of salt as a settled fact. History often works this way. A small word carries an old memory, though the precise shape of that memory has softened with time. The value of salt in Rome, then, was not a single dramatic thing. It was not the foundation of everything, nor was every Roman road built for it. Its importance was steadier and more practical. Salt helped food endure. It flavored sauces and meals. It supported animals and appeared in rituals. It moved from shining coastal pans to inland markets, from storage jars to kitchen tables, from spoken Latin into later languages. As afternoon light faded along a Roman road, sandaled feet might pass over stone worn smooth by years of travel. Somewhere near the coast, salt pans glimmered quietly. In a storeroom, amphorae rested in rows. In a market, bread, olives, herbs, and a little salty fish sauce waited for the evening meal. And in all these ordinary scenes, salt remained what it had long been, a small mineral with a wide journey, carried patiently through human hands. Chapter 8. Salt across deserts and seas. In the medieval centuries, salt continued its quiet journey across the world. It moved not only from shore to village, or from spring to market, but over great distances, through desert corridors, along sea lanes, across mountain roads, and into the storehouses of towns. By then, many communities had learned how to gather salt, boil it, mine it, dry it, tax it, and trade it. Yet the simple need remained the same. People required salt for their bodies, for their animals, for their food, and for the long seasons when fresh harvests were far away. Across the Sahara, salt traveled in one of its most memorable forms: large, pale slabs, cut from desert mines and carried by camel caravans. The Sahara was not empty in the way it may appear on a map. It held routes remembered by guides, wells known by generations, oases with palms and gardens, and towns where goods and ideas were exchanged. Along these routes, salt from places such as Tagaza and later Taoudini was cut from the earth in blocks. These slabs could be rough and heavy, their surfaces chalky white or gray, like pieces of an ancient dried sea lifted into the sun. At dawn, before the heat of the day rose from the sand, a caravan might begin to move. Camel bells sounded softly in the cool air. Pack saddles were checked, ropes were tightened, and salt slabs were balanced carefully against the animal's sides. The pale blocks stood out against dark leather and woven cloth. Slowly, in a long measured line, the caravan crossed the wide landscape, following paths shaped by memory, stars, wells, and resting places. The salt moved southward toward the Sahel, the semi-dry region south of the Sahara, where grasslands and towns connected desert trade with river valleys and farming lands. Cities such as Timbuktu became important centers within these networks. Timbuktu, near the Niger River, was not only a place of trade, but also a place of scholarship, manuscripts, and learning. Salt arrived there alongside many other goods. Gold came from regions farther south and west. Grain moved from fields and riverlands. Textiles, leather goods, copper, horses, books, and other items passed through the hands of merchants, travelers, and townspeople. People often speak of the gold-salt trade, and the phrase is useful because it points to an important pattern. Salt from the desert moved toward places where it was needed, while gold and other goods moved northward through wider networks. But the phrase is also a simplification. Trade was rarely a simple exchange between two goods or two places. Many intermediaries were involved. Values changed depending on distance, supply, demand, season, and local authority. Salt could be extremely valuable in inland areas far from sources, yet it was not equally precious everywhere. Near a coast, a salt lake, or a productive salt pan, it might be common. Far inland, after a long journey, it might be treasured. This is one of the gentle lessons salt teaches. Value is often shaped by place. A grain of salt beside the sea may seem ordinary, while the same grain carried across a desert becomes part of a larger labor of movement and exchange. The object itself remains simple, but the journey around it grows wide. Far to the north, the Mediterranean Sea carried salt by another rhythm. Instead of camel bells, there were ropes, sails, oars, gulls, and the creak of wooden docks. Salt moved between islands, lagoons, coastal pans, and port cities. Shallow basins near the shore held seawater until sun and wind drew the water away, leaving crystals behind. Workers gathered the salt into small white mounds, and merchants arranged its movement by ship. Barrels, sacks, baskets, and ledgers all became part of its passage. Venice, rising from its lagoon, became deeply involved in the salt trade. The city's position between sea routes and inland markets helped make salt an important part of its commerce and government revenue. Venetian authorities managed and taxed salt in different ways over time, understanding that a useful and widely needed commodity could support public finances. Salt was not the only source of Venice's wealth, of course. The city traded in many things: spices, textiles, grain, timber, glass, and metals. But salt had a special steadiness. People needed it in ordinary years and difficult years alike. Other Mediterranean ports also handled salt, along with fish, oil, wine, cloth, and grain. Ships moved from harbor to harbor, guided by winds, seasons, and agreements among merchants. In a port city, one might imagine a quiet morning as sailors unloaded cargo. Coiled ropes lay beside the quay. Wooden barrels stood in rows. Sails dried in the sun. The air carried the mingled scent of seawater, tar, fish, and stone warmed by daylight. Among the many goods, salt could seem modest, but it helped make other trade possible, especially the trade in preserved food. In Northern Europe, salt was closely tied to fish, particularly herring. Herring is a small, oily fish that travels in large schools and was caught in great quantities in the North Sea and Baltic regions. Fresh fish spoils quickly, but when cleaned, salted, and packed into wooden barrels, it could travel much farther. This supported long-distance trade and helped feed towns, monasteries, armies, and households through seasons when fresh food was limited. The herring trade became especially important in medieval and early modern Northern Europe. Salted fish moved through networks of merchants and ports. Salt for preserving fish often came from productive inland and coastal salt regions, including places in northern Germany and other parts of Europe. In a fish curing yard, the work followed practiced motions. Fish laid out, salt scattered, barrels filled, lids sealed. The result was not only food, but time made portable. A catch from one coast could nourish people many weeks or months later, far away. Salt also traveled across Asia in many forms, along caravan routes, river systems, and coastal waters. In some regions it came from salt lakes, and others from the sea, and elsewhere from brine wells or rock deposits. Like silk, tea, horses, spices, and metal goods, salt belonged to the broad fabric of exchange. It might move only a short distance from a local source, or it might pass through many hands before reaching a household. Its paths were often less famous than those of luxury goods, but they were deeply important because they supported daily life. Everywhere, salt trade required preparation. Someone had to cut, rake, boil, dry, pack, measure, carry, record, and sell it. Some was poured as coarse crystals into sacks. Some was sealed in jars or barrels. At each stage, people brought skill to a substance that seemed plain. They knew how to keep it dry, how to judge its weight, how to protect it from loss, and how to match its quality to its use. As salt moved through deserts and seas, it connected landscapes that felt very different from one another. A dry mine under a white sky, a green oasis, a river town, a lagoon at sunset, a northern harbor with barrels of fish, all could be joined by the same mineral. Salt belonged to merchants and cooks, governments and sailors, fishers and scholars, caravan leaders and market families. It passed quietly through their hands, leaving traces in laws, roads, meals, and memories. After following salt across such great distances, it is pleasant to bring the story inward again. Beyond the caravan road and the harbor, beyond the tax house and the market stall, there was the pantry, cool, dim, and practical. There, in crocks, barrels, jars, and cloth-lined boxes, salt helped families prepare for the year ahead. The long road of salt often ended in a simple room, where food was kept through winter, and where a pale crystal from desert or sea became part of the steady rhythm of home. Chapter 9. Salt in Kitchens and Winter Stores. After long journeys along roads, rivers, deserts, and seas, salt often came to rest in the quietest of places. A kitchen shelf, a wooden box, a clay jar, or a small cloth sack tied carefully at the top. There, away from the markets and caravans, It became part of daily work. A pinch in a pot, a handful in a crock, a layer between fish or meat, a spoonful stirred into brine. In ordinary homes, salt was not only a trade good or a source of revenue, it was a familiar helper in the turning of the year. Before modern refrigeration, keeping food through changing seasons required attention, knowledge, and time. Harvests did not arrive evenly every day. Fish ran in certain months. Animals were often slaughtered at particular times of year. Gardens gave cabbage, cucumbers, turnips, beans, or herbs in their own seasons. Milk came fresh and warm, but it did not remain so for long. Families, cooks, farmers, fishers, and herders learned many ways to carry food forward from abundance into leaner months. Salt was one of the most useful tools in this work. Its preserving power begins with a simple effect. Salt draws water outward. When salt is rubbed onto fish, mixed with chopped cabbage, or packed around meat, it pulls moisture from the food and from many tiny living things that might cause spoilage. These tiny living things are called microbes. Some microbes are helpful, and some can make food decay or become unsafe. By reducing available water, salt makes it harder for many unwanted microbes to grow. This did not mean salt could make every food safe in every condition. Preservation was never a single magic act. The amount of salt mattered. So did moisture, temperature, acidity, cleanliness, and time. A cool cellar helped, smoke helped, dry air helped, vinegar helped, fermentation helped. People learned by practice, by family memory, by local custom, and by careful watching. In many homes, preservation was skilled seasonal labor, repeated year after year. Imagine a cool pantry in late autumn. Shelves line the wall, and on them stand jars, crocks, baskets, and small barrels. The air holds the sense of herbs, wood, smoke, vinegar, and stone. Outside, the fields are resting. Perhaps the first snow has settled in the lanes. Inside, food is stored with care. Salted fish racked and stacked. Pickled vegetables beneath their brine. Cheese aging in a quiet corner. Butter kept cool. Dried herbs hanging from a beam. Fish was one of the great companions of salt. Along coasts, rivers, and lakes, a catch could be plentiful for a short time and scarce later. Fresh fish spoils quickly, so preserving it mattered deeply. Coarse salt might be rubbed gently into the flesh, or fish might be layered with salt in barrels. Sometimes it was dried in the wind. Sometimes it was smoked over a slow fire, where fragrant wood added another kind of protection and flavor. Salted fish could travel far inland, feeding towns and villages that were distant from the sea. Meat, too, was often cured with salt. Curing means preserving food, especially meat or fish, with salt, and sometimes with smoke, spices, or drying. In colder regions, meat could be processed after autumn slaughter, when the air itself helped keep it cool. Salt was worked into the surface or packed around pieces that would later be hung, dried, smoked, or stored. The result varied greatly by place and by household. Some preserved meats were treasured and carefully made. Others were simple and practical, intended to stretch food through the year. Vegetables found their own quiet path into winter through pickling and fermentation. Pickling can mean preserving food in vinegar or in salty water called brine. A stone crock might be filled with cucumbers, cabbage, turnips, or other vegetables. Salt would be added, sometimes with water, sometimes simply mixed into the vegetables until their own juices emerged. A clean weight might hold everything beneath the liquid. In fermented foods such as sauerkraut, salt plays a guiding role. Fermentation is a natural process in which helpful microbes change food, often making it tangy, longer lasting, and easier to keep. Salt does not stop all microbial life. Instead, at the right strength, it helps favor certain helpful microbes while slowing others. In a crock of cabbage, the right amount of salt encourages the development of acidity, which gives sauerkraut its bright taste and helps preserve it. It is a quiet cooperation between vegetable, salt, time, and living processes too small to see. Dairy foods also depended on salt. Cheese making turned fresh milk into something more durable, varied, and flavorful. Salt could be mixed into curds, rubbed onto a cheese, or dissolved into brine for soaking. It helped draw out moisture, shape texture, influenced the rind, and guided the activity of microbes within the cheese. In a cool cellar, wheels or blocks of cheese rested on boards. turned and watched over as days lengthened into weeks or months. Butter, in many places, was salted as well. Salted butter kept better than fresh butter and carried a clean, savory taste. In some households, it was packed into crocks and stored in a cool place. In others, it traveled to market, wrapped or sealed, carrying with it the labor of milking, churning, washing, salting, and shaping. Olives, too, have long been linked with salt. Fresh olives are bitter and need careful preparation before they become the familiar food of the table. Brining, washing, curing, and sometimes fermenting help transform them. In Mediterranean homes and workshops, olives could rest in jars or vats, slowly changing in salty liquid, becoming softer in flavor and more pleasant to eat. Salt also changed foods that were not preserved for long storage. In bread, a small amount of salt strengthened flavor and affected the feel of the dough. It helped regulate fermentation so the rising process stayed more balanced. In a loaf, salt did not stand apart as a sharp taste. It blended into the grain, making the bread seem fuller and more complete. In cooking more broadly, salt drew flavors together. It could soften bitterness, deepen sweetness, and bring forward the taste of vegetables, grains, soups, and stews. A cook did not always need much. A careful pinch might be enough. Salt dissolved into water-based foods and spread invisibly through broth or sauce, leaving no crystal behind, only a changed flavor. Still, the kitchens of the past should not be imagined as always full or easy. Food preservation required effort, fuel, vessels, storage space, and knowledge. Salt itself could be costly in some places and common in others. Quality varied. A barrel might spoil if conditions were wrong. A winter store might be generous one year and thin the next. The calm order of a pantry came from steady work and from the long human wish to prepare wisely for what lay ahead. Across many regions, the preserving season had its rhythm. Fish were cleaned on wooden boards, meat was cut and salted, cabbage was shredded and pressed into crocks, brine was poured over cucumbers with dill, garlic, or local herbs, cheese was carried down into a cellar where the air was cool and even. Smoke rose slowly from a small fire. Jars were sealed, barrels were tightened, hands were washed, cloths were wrung, shelves were arranged. In these household acts, salt connected the large world to the small one. The same mineral that crossed deserts in slabs and moved through ports in sacks also settled into the grain of a cheese, the skin of a fish, the folds of cabbage in a crock. It helped families make use of a season's plenty and remember the needs of the months to come. And so, in a quiet kitchen, a measure of salt might sit beside the day's work, not grand, not rare in appearance, only pale grains in a bowl or box. Yet because every household needed it, and because every market could measure it, salt would also draw the attention of rulers, tax collectors, and states. From the pantry shelf, the story widens again, toward ledgers, storehouses, laws, and the careful control of an everyday necessity. Chapter 10: Taxes, Monopolies, and Quiet Resistance. As salt traveled through kitchens, markets, ports, and storehouses, it also passed through the hands of officials. A small white grain could seem simple on a table, but to governments, it had a special quality. Nearly everyone needed it, and in many places, it came from sources that could be watched. A coastal salt pan, a brine well, a mine, a lake bed, or a warehouse near a river road. This made salt easier to tax than many other goods. A tax is money, or sometimes goods, collected by a government. Grain might be grown in countless fields, and animals might move from pasture to pasture, but salt often gathered at known places before it spread outward. There it could be weighed, recorded, sealed, and sent along. In quiet storehouses, sacks of salt might be stacked against cool walls. A clerk might mark a ledger with careful lines of ink. A seal might be pressed into wax or clay to show that a duty had been paid. At a market stall, salt could be measured into small sacks, each one ordinary in appearance, yet connected to law, revenue, and authority. A monopoly is another way governments controlled salt. In a monopoly, one authority has control over making or selling something. Sometimes the state itself produced salt. Sometimes it licensed merchants to sell it. Sometimes it set prices, restricted movement, or required people to buy a certain amount. These systems were not all the same. They varied from place to place, and they changed over time. Yet they shared one idea: because salt was necessary, control over salt could bring steady income. China offers one of the longest and most important examples. Across many dynasties, salt was a major source of state revenue. China had many kinds of salt production: sea salt along the coast, lake salt in dry regions, rock salt, and brine drawn from underground wells. In some areas, officials supervised production and distribution. In others, licensed merchants handled the trade under government rules. The income from salt helped support armies, administration, roads, granaries, and the many expenses of a large state. But salt policy also raised questions. If the government controlled something that every household needed, how should prices be set? How much burden should fall on ordinary people? How much freedom should merchants have? These questions were discussed in ancient China with unusual clarity. In 81 BCE, during the Han Dynasty, officials and scholars debated state control of salt and iron in what became known as the Discourses on Salt and Iron. The words came from a particular moment, but the questions were lasting ones: how to balance public revenue, private trade, fairness, and daily need. Far away in France, salt also became closely tied to government power. The French salt tax was known as the gabelle. The word itself came to carry a heavy feeling for many people, because the tax was not simple or equal across the kingdom. Different regions paid different rates. Some areas had strict rules about how much salt people had to buy. Others had lower taxes or special privileges. These differences encouraged smuggling, resentment, and confusion. For a household, salt was not a luxury. It was needed for cooking, preserving food, feeding animals, and preparing stores for the year. When salt was expensive because of tax, the cost touched daily life in small, repeated ways. A family buying salt at an official store might feel the weight of law in a simple purchase. A trader moving salt across a boundary might need papers, payments, or permission. In the years before the French Revolution, the gabelle became one grievance among many. It did not cause the revolution by itself, but it stood as a familiar example of unfairness to many people who lived under it. Salt taxes appeared in many other societies as well. Some were mild, some severe. Some were carefully organized, while others were uneven. Governments often returned to salt for the same reason. It was needed by rich and poor alike, and it could be counted at its source. But what seemed practical from an office could feel burdensome in a kitchen. In British-ruled India, the salt tax became especially symbolic. Salt was used by people across regions, religions, languages, and social classes. It flavored food, preserved food, and supported daily life in hot climates where the body loses salts through sweat. British law restricted Indians from freely making salt from seawater in many circumstances, and required them to buy taxed salt. For many, this made the tax feel not only costly, but deeply unfair, because salt could be gathered from the shore by natural means. In 1930, Mohandas Gandhi chose salt as the focus of a peaceful protest. He understood that salt was humble and universal. It was not distant from ordinary people. It sat in kitchens, traveled in small packets, and touched every meal. Gandhi began a long walk from his ashram to the coastal village of Dandi. The journey became known as the Salt March. He and his followers walked slowly over dusty roads, passing villages and fields, gathering attention as they went. The march was not hurried. Its power came partly from its patience. Step by step, it turned a daily necessity into a public question: who had the right to take salt from the sea? At Dandi on the coast, the morning air carried the sound of waves. Gandhi picked up salty mud and later made salt from seawater, breaking the law in a deliberate, peaceful way. This was an act of civil disobedience, which means peacefully breaking the law in order to protest it. The salt itself was small, only a pinch, yet its meaning was large. It stood for dignity, self-rule, and the right of ordinary people to share in the resources around them. The Salt March did not immediately end the salt tax, nor did it immediately end British rule in India. History often moves more gradually than a single event can show, but the march became a powerful symbol. It drew people into the independence movement and showed how a simple object could carry a clear message. Salt, so often controlled through ledgers and seals, had become a sign of quiet resistance. Across these many places, China, France, India, and others, salt reminds us that necessity and power often meet in ordinary things. A government may see a source of revenue. A merchant may see a regulated cargo. A household may see the means to season soup, preserve fish, or prepare food for winter. The same crystal can belong to law, trade, and daily care all at once. And so the story of salt moves gently from tax sacks and guarded storehouses toward another age. Salt would become not only a household necessity, but a modern material of mines, evaporation ponds, factories, chemistry, roads, and public services. Yet even in that wider industrial world, it would keep something of its old character, pale, useful, and quietly present in the work of human life. Chapter 11. Industry, Science, and Modern Salt. As the long story of salt moves into the modern world, the old patterns are still there, though they have grown larger and more carefully organized. Salt still comes from sea, earth, and brine. It still appears where water has carried minerals, where ancient oceans have dried and been buried, or where sunlight slowly draws moisture into the air. What has changed is the scale, and the number of uses that now surround this small, pale crystal. In some places, salt is taken directly from underground beds of rock salt. This rock salt is called halite, the same mineral formed long ago when seas or lakes evaporated and left their dissolved salts behind. Over time, layers of sediment covered these deposits, pressing them into the earth. A modern salt mine may reach deep below fields, towns, or lake beds, into quiet chambers where the walls are gray-white, amber, or softly translucent. Lights shine along tunnels cut into the mineral, and the air has a dry, faintly sharp quality. Many rock salt mines use a method called room and pillar mining. The idea is simple. Miners remove salt in broad open spaces, called rooms, but leave large blocks standing in place, called pillars. These pillars help support the ceiling, much as columns support the roof of an old hall. The pattern can continue through the deposit in a steady arrangement of open space and solid salt. Machines cut, loosen, and gather the rock. Conveyor belts carry broken pieces away, grain by grain, and load by load, until the salt reaches the surface to be sorted, crushed, and sent onward. Another modern method is solution mining. In this process, water is sent down into an underground salt deposit. The water dissolves the salt, becoming brine, which means very salty water. This brine is then pumped back up to the surface. It's a little like drawing an ancient sea from beneath the ground, not as waves, but as a clear, mineral-rich liquid. Once at the surface, the brine can be used directly in industry, or it can be evaporated to leave solid salt behind. Evaporation, one of the oldest salt-making methods, remains important today. Along warm coasts and in sunny inland regions, seawater or salty lake water may be guided into shallow ponds. These solar evaporation ponds rest under open sky like wide, still mirrors. As the sun warms them and the wind moves softly across them, water slowly disappears into the air. The brine becomes stronger, and crystals begin to form. Some ponds look white with salt. Others may appear pale pink, rose, green, or blue because of minerals, algae, and tiny salt-loving organisms that live in very salty water. From above, such ponds can look like calm pieces of colored glass set into the earth. There is also vacuum evaporation, a more controlled industrial process. Brine is placed in large vessels, sometimes called vacuum pans, where the pressure is lowered. Water can boil at a lower temperature. This allows the water to evaporate efficiently, leaving behind purified salt crystals. Steam rises, machinery hums, and the process continues in a measured way. The salt produced this way can be very clean and uniform, useful for food, medicine, and industry. Although many people first think of salt as something kept near a kitchen stove or set on a table, most salt used today is not eaten directly. Industrial salt is often more important by volume than food salt. It's a raw material, which means it's a basic substance used to make other things. In factories and chemical plants, salt becomes part of a much wider world of paper, glass, soap, textiles, plastics, water treatment, and medical supplies. One especially important process is called the chlor-alkali process. The name sounds technical, but the basic idea can be explained gently. Salt brine is treated with electricity, and the sodium chloride in the brine is separated into useful substances. This process produces chlorine, sodium hydroxide, and hydrogen. Chlorine is used in water treatment and in making many materials. Sodium hydroxide, also called caustic soda, is used in making paper, soaps, detergents, textiles, and other products. Hydrogen has its own industrial uses as well. From this one familiar mineral, many branches of modern life quietly extend. Chlorine helps keep drinking water safer in many places. Sodium hydroxide helps turn wood pulp into paper and helps make cleaning products. Salt-derived chemicals are used in the production of PVC, a common plastic found in pipes, flooring, and many manufactured goods. In medicine, carefully prepared salt solutions are used because the human body itself depends on a balanced amount of dissolved salts. A clear medical solution in a bottle may seem far removed from an ancient salt pan, yet it belongs to the same long story. Salt is also used in water softening. Hard water contains minerals such as calcium and magnesium, which can leave scale in pipes and appliances. In many water softening systems, salt helps exchange those minerals for sodium, making the water less likely to form hard deposits. The salt itself does not simply make the water feel soft by being salty. Rather, it helps the system refresh the materials that remove the hardness. In colder climates, salt has another familiar use. Coarse crystals are spread on winter roads and walkways for de-icing, which means melting ice or helping prevent it from forming. Salt lowers the freezing point of water, so ice can turn to slush at temperatures where it might otherwise remain solid. On a gray winter morning, roads may be dusted with white grains that crunch softly beneath tires and boots. This use can make travel safer, but it also has complications. De-icing salt can affect soil, freshwater streams, roadside plants, vehicles, and bridges. Modern communities often try to balance usefulness with care, applying salt thoughtfully and exploring other methods where they can. So in the modern age, salt is both ordinary and immense. It moves through mines, pipes, ponds, pans, rail cars, ships, and factories. It becomes food seasoning, road treatment, glass, paper, soap, plastic, and medicine. It is measured by the pinch and by the ton, yet its sources remain familiar. Rock left by vanished seas, brine drawn from underground, seawater resting beneath sunlight. From the quiet tunnels of a mine to the wide shimmer of evaporation ponds, salt continues its patient journey. And after all the large works of industry and science, the story can return once more to the small grain itself, waiting in a bowl, a shaker, a cellar, or a kitchen cupboard, simple to see, and carrying within it a very long memory of earth and sea. Chapter 12. The Small White Grain Today. In many kitchens today, salt waits quietly in a small bowl, a shaker, a wooden box, or a paper packet folded at the top. It may be fine and white, flowing like pale sand. It may be coarse and irregular, with crystals large enough to catch the light. It may come from an ancient underground bed, from a modern evaporation pond, or from seawater dried by sun and wind. Yet beneath these different forms, most table salt is still the same familiar mineral that has traveled through this whole long story. It is mostly sodium chloride, sodium joined with chlorine in a stable crystal. In pure form, those crystals tend toward tiny cubes, though by the time they reach a kitchen, they may be ground, flaked, crushed, sifted, or shaped by the method used to make them. A container of ordinary table salt often holds more than sodium chloride alone. Many kinds include a small amount of an anti-caking agent. This is a simple additive that helps keep the grains dry and free-flowing, so the salt does not clump too tightly in damp air. In a humid kitchen, near steaming pots and open windows, that small addition can make salt easier to pour and measure. Some table salt is iodized. Iodized salt contains iodine, a nutrient needed by the thyroid, a small gland in the neck that helps regulate many body processes. Without enough iodine, people can develop health problems, including goiter, which is a swelling of the thyroid gland. In the 20th century, adding iodine to salt became an important public health idea because salt was already used regularly by many households. Early iodized salt programs appeared in places such as Switzerland and the United States, and over time the practice spread more widely. It was a simple thought with a wide reach: place a needed nutrient into something already present on the table. Not everywhere has the same iodine needs, and not every person uses iodized salt, but in many regions it has helped reduce iodine deficiency. Like many chapters in the history of salt, it shows how a small crystal can connect private meals with public health and kitchen habits with the well-being of whole communities. On shelves today, salt appears under many names: sea salt, rock salt, kosher salt, table salt, flake salt, and other specialty salts may look and feel different from one another. Their crystals may be fine, coarse, flat, hollow, or irregular. Some dissolve quickly, others add a brief, delicate crunch. Some are carefully refined, while others keep tiny traces of minerals from the place where they formed. Some contain iodine or anti-caking agents, and some do not. These differences matter in cooking, especially in texture and measuring. A spoonful of fine table salt can hold more salt by weight than a spoonful of large, airy flakes, because the fine grains pack closely together. A cook may sprinkle coarse crystals over bread before baking, or use fine salt in dough where it can disperse evenly. But nutritionally, most of these salts are still mostly sodium chloride. The trace minerals in specialty salts are usually present in very small amounts, and it is best not to think of them as a major source of nutrition. Salt is neither simply good nor simply harmful. The body needs sodium in small amounts. Sodium helps with fluid balance, nerve signals, and muscle function. It is one of the quiet minerals that allows the body's inner waters to move and communicate properly. At the same time, many people today consume more sodium than they need, and high sodium intake is associated with an increased risk of high blood pressure in many individuals. For this reason, modern health guidance often recommends moderation while also making sure people receive enough iodine where it is needed. In this balanced way, salt remains what it has often been: useful, powerful in small quantities, and best understood with care. A pinch may enliven a pot of soup. Too many pinches may overwhelm it. The lesson belongs as much to cooking as to health. In the kitchen, salt does many gentle kinds of work. It enhances flavor, not by adding only its own taste, but by helping other tastes become clearer. It can soften bitterness, deepen sweetness, and bring out the quiet richness in grains, vegetables, beans, and broths. In bread dough, salt strengthens flavor and also helps regulate fermentation, the process by which yeast and other tiny living organisms transform dough over time. Without salt, bread can taste flat. With too much, the dough may rise more slowly than intended. In the right amount, it becomes part of the rhythm. Salt affects texture too. It helps draw moisture from vegetables. It firms cheese. It shapes cured foods. It dissolves into soups, sauces, and stews, spreading invisibly through the liquid until no grain can be seen. A cook may stir once, wait a moment, taste, and find that the whole pot has changed. And so the long history of salt returns to ordinary gestures. Fine grains slip through fingers into boiling water. Coarse crystals scatter softly across bread dough. A spoon dips into a warm stew. A small ceramic bowl sits near the edge of a table, holding a little mound of white. Inside that bowl is a memory much larger than it appears. There is the sea, lifting and falling under sunlight. There are ancient lakes drying into mineral beds. There are brine wells, bamboo pipes, clay jars, desert slabs, market roads, riverboats, salt pans, cellars, barrels, and winter stores. There are taxes and ledgers, careful rituals, quiet kitchens, and fields where animals once followed mineral paths through grass and stone. A grain of salt may begin in water, rest in earth, travel by road or ship, and end in a meal. It may be visible for a moment on the fingertip, bright and angular, and then disappear completely. In a quiet evening kitchen, steam rises from a bowl of soup. A few grains fall in and dissolve. The crystal is no longer seen, but its presence remains, softened into flavor, carrying with it the memory of oceans, deserts, wells, markets, roads, and homes.